Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of Free Thought Hour, our weekly show where we interview a guest. And to help me do that, I have my co-host, Tercia Duplessis. Welcome, Tercia. How are you?
I'm fine, John. We have electricity. It's not too cold. It's not too hot. And I'm ready for tonight's guest.
Good heavens. Things are looking up in the Western Cape, aren't they? Yeah.
Now,
Good. Well, tonight's guest is Tim Bollands. And how the devil are you, Tim?
I'm very well indeed. Thank you, John. It's been a beautiful day here. It's so nice to see the end of winter. So I've spent the day in the garden, sitting enjoying the sun.
Excellent. What a way to spend Easter, eh? It's far better than the alternative, you know.
Exactly. Exactly.
So you call yourself a natural philosopher on your is it your Facebook or your Twitter? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Twitter. Yeah, that's where we met, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So the first thing that I want to talk about, because this has been sort of bugging me in various communications, because I argue a lot. Well, I like to think it's debate rather than argue on the internet, and I get involved with philosophers, and I'm prepared to admit I don't know much about philosophy. My background is I'm a retired science teacher, so I'm not educated or experienced in the art of philosophy, but I'm aware that science came out of natural philosophy. So what actually is, I think it goes back to, is it Aristotle or Socrates? But
absolutely. Aristotle probably say was the greatest natural philosopher. In that he established our understanding of the universe, an understanding which lasted a good 2,000 or so years. And probably the next lot of natural philosophers we tend to talk about are those around the 17th century. Of Galileo, Isaac Newton, and I guess Nicholas Copernicus. And if I was to distinguish natural philosophy from science, because I think the popular belief is that natural philosophy became science, and now we don't need natural philosophy anymore. And I mean, the two do study the same thing, the natural world. But there is a distinction, I think, between the two. Science is much more of a discipline. There is such a thing as a scientific method, broadly speaking, and scientists follow this method. They need evidence, they need experiment, theory, etc. Whereas for natural philosophy, it's a little freer. There's fewer rules as to how they make their arguments, you might say. That's the first way they differ. The second, and you might say more important way, is that science, I think, is based upon certain fundamental beliefs about the world. Beliefs as materialism, atomism, and very importantly, determinism. The idea that the universe is one that's ruled by laws of nature. These are beliefs that were established by natural philosophers, or at least philosophers, and I would say that they are natural philosophers. Most notably, as I said, around about the 17th century. And if you believe that those are correct beliefs, the correct fundamental beliefs about the world, then you can argue that we don't need natural philosophy anymore, that we just have science. And science does all of the hard graft of investigating the world, defining the theories, testing them, and so on. So why would you need natural philosophy? Well, the problem with that idea, excuse me a minute. The problem with that idea is that science every now and then comes across a problem that it can't solve, or a big question it has no answer to. And what it finds is that the only way to answer that question or solve the problem is to challenge some of those fundamental beliefs. And that activity of doing that, even if it's carried out by scientists, I would argue is natural philosophy.
Oh, that's interesting.
So,
Yeah.
John, can I come in here?
I'm sorry.
Go
So
ahead,
I wanted to,
Mhm.
I want to ask or comment, not sure which, but as far as I know, the term scientist was coined in the 18th century, and if I'm not mistaken, Mary Shelley or one of those guys
Yeah.
had to do with the coining of the word science.
I think
And
the word goes back longer than that. Actually, I think there's. I don't know exactly where,
well,
but
well
it's
the word
used to mean
scientist.
knowledge in the old.
That's it. That's it. But the
Medieval.
word scientist, as applied to what you now, what used to be called natural philosophers.
Mm.
So, what I find really interesting about what you've been saying is that I have yet to come across a scientist who's not also a natural philosopher. I think. Would you
Yeah.
agree with me that all scientists are natural philosophers, but not all natural philosophers are scientists? Would that be a fair statement?
I'm not
Wow.
sure I'd agree with that.
Okay.
If you've heard of a chap called Thomas Kuhn, he was a philosopher, and he talked about, he was a philosopher of science, really. And he talked about the scientific revolutions, the most famous one being, as I was referring to earlier, in the 17th century with Copernicus. But there's been other ones since, where there's this kind of a step change in science. And it's when somebody has looked at the state of play. They've been doing normal science for a while, where they don't challenge some of those fundamental beliefs, but they hit against a brick wall, and then they realize, okay, we've made some fundamental assumption that we've got wrong, and we need to change that. It's those major changing points, that points of change, that in my mind, at least,
Well, I find that very interesting, because what it seems to me you're saying is that we use scientific method, the hypothesis, investigate for observations that might match the prediction, draw a conclusion, see if you can assemble several conclusions into a theory, and so on. We use that while it works. But then when we come to a frontier, then we go back to the philosophical side of it, the thinking about it, rather than the doing of it.
Absolutely right. And I think the greatest example of that, well, it's not quite recent years, it's about 100 years ago, was a man you might have heard about, Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein had the problem, well, not just him, all the physicists at the time had the problem to solve of the constancy of light, the constancy of the speed of light. And I don't know how well your viewers will know this, but essentially every observer measures light to have the same speed, and it doesn't matter how fast the observer is traveling. So even if you're traveling at 1,000,000 miles an hour in the direction of that particle of light, you'll still measure the speed of light as the same as somebody who is stationary. Now that shouldn't be the case. That just doesn't really make any sense.
That is counterintuitive.
It's entirely counterintuitive. So what Einstein did was challenged our fundamental beliefs about time and space. Beliefs that, I mean, really we've had, and for about as far back as you can imagine going, but certainly the beliefs that were around at the time of Isaac Newton. So we talk about the Newtonian worldview. And Newton's idea of absolute space and absolute time. And what Albert Einstein was able to do was say, actually, maybe we've got that wrong, and that time and space are somehow interchangeable, or that one relates to the other. I won't go into the details, honestly, I'll be here all day. But it's that sort of ability to just pause for a second. Particularly when you're faced with a problem that is not just difficult to solve, but is impossible to solve. If everything we know about the world is true, then this problem has no solution. And therefore, if we believe that problems like this ought to have solutions, that means that something we believe about the world is not true.
Yes.
If we doubt that will breakthrough.
One of our basic assumptions is what you mean, isn't it? is not
That's
correct.
right. That's
Yeah. And this happened again, didn't it, when quantum theory was being formulated?
It did. Well, I'd argue not successfully. You see,
Interesting.
they had a similar problem, and it was called the wave-particle duality. The idea
Yeah.
that light appears to, according to certain experiments, act as a particle. It delivers its energy to an object in a single packet, if you like. So it acts as a particle, but it seems to travel as a wave, and it seems to go through gaps in a wall. Say 2 slits in a wall is the famous double slit experiment. It goes through that as if it's a wave proceeding through space.
Yes.
It seems to expand out into space, and yet when it delivers its energy to the screen, it does so in a single point.
Yes.
And they're faced with this challenge of, well, how do we make sense of that? And I would argue they never have, because physicists are still arguing today about what is the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Well, one
the reason they do that is because every one doesn't make sense. Whichever one you choose, there's a problem.
Is it the Stockholm interpretation or the what's the alternative? I can't remember.
The Copenhagen interpretation.
Oh yes, Copenhagen. Yes,
the one
the wrong Scandinavian city. Yes. But one physicist stroke cosmologist that I know thinks that trying to twist the data into an interpretation so that we can understand it is a fallacious exercise, because we're presented with the data. Why do we have to try and manipulate it to fit our rather puny brains?
I would argue that is a defeatist attitude. I would say that I mean, that's the equivalent of the shut up and calculate, which was I forget which physicist, some reasonably famous physicist was said to have said those words. I think the words have become more famous than he was, probably. But yeah, it's an attitude that says we as you said, our puny brains are too weak to actually figure it out, so let's not try. I reject that idea. I really do.
Tim,
there's a position within philosophy known as Mysterianism, and it's often used in relation to the hard problem of consciousness, and it goes along the lines of our conscious minds are not capable of understanding the mystery of the conscious mind. So we can just stop now. We should give up. And I really do think that's defeatist, especially because I'm sitting here saying, well, I think I've solved that problem. I think I've solved the problem of consciousness.
We must hear it. We want to hear
it. Tim, before you get to explaining to us how you've solved the problem of consciousness, as the puny-brained amongst in the conversation, who's still trying to grapple to understand relativity, that's general and specific, because I haven't been able to really crack that, and I will not even begin to talk about quantum physics. But I want to ask you, would you say that a natural philosopher can engage in empirical science, or not? Just
I think you need to base any science or natural philosophy on evidence. There's no doubt about that. And I think trying to identify the experiments that would test your theories again is an important part of it. So in that respect, there is certainly a blurred line between what I'm calling natural philosophy and science. But science is the everyday hard graft that scientists carry out every day, as part of a profession, if you like. Philosophy is much more that you sit back in an armchair, you light your pipe, and you ponder the bigger questions, and you consider whether we've got something wrong.
I know philosophers who would object to that.
I know. And these are stereotypes, but that's just back to your original question. That's the kind of distinction I'm trying to make. That the philosophers are not prepared to to question the fundamental. But it's not the distinction between philosophers and scientists. It's between philosophy and science, because I think the vast majority of natural philosophy of the last 200 years has been carried out by scientists, such as
yes. And I would just like to say that I think it's really important that scientists, even those who do the hard graft and who don't spend a lot of time in their armchairs, need a sound philosophical grounding, because I think that not only natural philosophy, but if we go one step back, philosophy is a very important grounding of everything we do, because all our science, everything we know, I think, is based in philosophy, because philosophy is to me, it's the love of knowledge, and everything begins with the love of knowledge and finding out and learning, and I think it's a pity that we've moved away in our education systems from the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? The sort of classical education, where you had the mathematics, and the language, but you always had the philosophy as part of it, because it was taught as an integrated whole. And I think we should move back to that principle in our education systems. So I really like this idea of a natural philosopher, and of making the idea of natural philosophy acceptable in the discourse.
Well, you said a moment ago that scientists would benefit from understanding the philosophy, and I think that's right. I think, as I said, those sort of fundamental beliefs that we base science upon, at least recognizing what those are and why, and having a good understanding of why we believe them, would then at least enable the scientists to consider that the possibility that they're not true, because there is no hard scientific evidence for the belief in atomism, for example. The belief that that when you break matter down into molecules, into atoms, into particles, into subparticles, that at some point you come to an end. And when you come to an end, the laws of nature that apply at that level are the fundamental laws of nature. So scientists around the physicists in particular, around the world are spending billions. I mean, probably literally, because things like the Large Hadron Collider, is part of that number. They're spending billions on trying to find the theory of everything and the fundamental laws of nature. Well, how do we know such things exist? If my theory of the world, my worldview is correct, there are no such things as the fundamental laws of nature.
But before we go there, I want to clear up 2 points.
Sure, sorry, but just to finish that, the point is that if you understand the basic fundamental beliefs on which your science is based, then at least it gives you the possibility that at some point you might revisit some of those assumptions.
Okay, so when, because what you're talking about here is the axioms, isn't it? The beliefs that we've chosen to ground our tower that we've been building on, and it worries me sometimes, because I meet philosophers who want to challenge everything, So instead of being grounded, you're actually in quicksand, and you're going deeper and deeper into these assumptions cannot be made. You can't actually observe anything, because you're making the assumption that there is such a thing as necessity and possibility, but that's not the scientific way. Science says, okay, we've accepted this stuff, let's go up, not down. Is it possible to overthink some things?
Definitely is possible. I think this is where I come back to why would you do this? There's a chap called Descartes. I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yep.
And he said, we can't really be sure about anything. So the way to make progress is to use this method of hyperbolic doubt, where I doubt everything that I know. and you effectively cast out all the knowledge you have. You start from scratch and you start to build up from there. He failed in that task, absolutely failed, because it was more than was necessary. So how do you decide where, in your terminology, where you dig down as opposed to building up? Well, in my view, you build up as far as you can until you hit that brick wall and you can't go up any further. And then you think, okay, well, maybe I've built my tower in the wrong place. So you run down, you maybe dig down a little bit, and maybe you start building on a slightly different foundation, so long as you've got a good reason for why that's going to be successful. So the good reason is that I have a problem here, like Einstein did, about the constant speed of light. And I have a good reason to challenge our understanding of time and space. What he didn't do was at the same time challenge every other fundamental assumption that we had. He just stuck with those. So it was a gradual change, a gradual evolution, if you like, but involving those step changes where you challenge those fundamental beliefs.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that Einstein didn't really delve into metaphysics. He stuck with, as far as possible, scientific method in a classical sense. Is that right?
Yes, I'd probably agree with that. I think I'd probably agree that some areas of metaphysics can get deeper than they need to.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can, be exploring questions where, you have to think, well, what's the purpose of this? What's the fundamental benefit? And exactly. I am at heart a scientist, but as I said, I think you delve into those questions where there's a problem to be solved. Ultimately, we're trying to build a coherent description of the world, and I think the majority of science is pretty coherent. It's very, very good, that body of knowledge that science has built up, and that's the best anything we've got anywhere else. But every now and then we just have to revisit it where we hit these problems
and check whether our foundation is really solid. So what you're saying. Okay, Tessie, you go ahead.
No, I wanted to say it also, we need to keep in mind that at a practical level, if you're doing engineering and you're building a structure, then Newtonian physics still works perfectly well. You don't have to. So and you might be using quantum physics in the latest computer modeling, but as the engineer evaluating the strength of a structure, you're not concerned. And as I say, Newtonian physics still works perfectly well. I think that's what Einstein and the likes of him, they never said we now have to doubt Newtonian physics. In fact, if I'm not completely wrong, they used Newtonian physics principles to prove the science that they were conducting. I mean, the later science didn't just throw out everything. It does happen from time to time that, for example, the germ theory of disease. And so sometimes we have to throw out an idea, but in other cases, we find out new information that enhances or slightly changes in a certain context how we do science. But I think that's where the philosophical grounding is important, because that's where you have to be able to make that, to take that different path, take that different direction. And I think, once again, Einstein is a good example, because as far as I'm also know, he didn't accept he didn't accept quantum physics. He said,
that's right.
So
I agree with him.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I don't know. I don't understand either physics or relativity properly, so I'll just live in the real world for now.
I mean, another example, just to agree with you, but also give a slightly different spin on it. The classic example of a problem from the 17th century was the problem of planetary motion, because at the time everybody knew that the Earth was at the center of the universe and was stationary, and that the stars traveled overhead, fixed to these enormous invisible celestial spheres. Everybody knew that because that's what Aristotle said, and they knew that they could trust Aristotle. Of course, what they did is solve the problem of these strange stars that moved forward one day and then backwards and forward. And they changed it by placing the sun at the center, with the Earth as one of the planets. And that changed our entire view of the universe. Now, I would say that that's a lot easier to understand than, say, Einstein. So while people use Isaac Newton because it's a lot harder to use Einstein's and theory. And
it's good enough.
Gravity, don't typically think about curved space.
For most applications that aren't in either the incredibly micro world or the incredibly macro world, Newton's is good enough, isn't it?
Absolutely. And for most engineering projects, we don't need to imagine the Earth spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, moving through space. We imagine that the world is fixed. As Aristotle said.
What non-scientists don't realize is we're playing games. We're modeling. And sometimes our models are not very good, and we've got to melt them down and make a new one.
Yeah, the world is a complex place, and we try and simplify it by creating a model in our head.
Yeah, that's right. What worries me, though, with your, and I agree with your postulate in principle that you can overthink things, and really we want to accept our axioms as solid, unless with extenuating extreme circumstances when we've really got to say, hang on a minute, But what worries me about that is what you're saying is you're introducing a concept of utility here. Is it useful to challenge these axioms, or should we be building upwards from them, maintaining the assumption that they are true, which is what's got scientists, which has got science as so far as it has. We've got a remote autonomous helicopter on Mars, so our assumptions must be some good to enable that. So what worries me is who makes this judgment of whether something is useful to investigate or not?
Well, I guess the natural philosopher does when
the people of the money
they're trying to solve. So if you are trying to solve the problem of consciousness, I mean, here's a related problem. You might like this. So here's a related problem to the hard problem of consciousness. It is the question of which animals are conscious and which animals are not conscious. Tend to start from a belief that let's say a microbe is not conscious. If maybe a flea or an ant, they're not really conscious. A mouse, yeah, maybe a little bit, but not like a human being, much less so. A dog, a cat, oh well, they're really quite conscious because we get to know them, but they're still not the same as a human being. I mean, let's face it, humans are there, cats maybe are there, and it goes all the way down. At some point, the light goes off. And when you get down to microbes, then clearly there's no consciousness there. That's what we believe. Okay, so where do you draw the line? At what point does the light go on? Is it a gradual line, or is it gradual, like I've said? Or is there a point, does an ant have any awareness of itself, of its surroundings? Does a fish? What would you say was the answer?
Well, I'm entirely confused because I'm aware that some microbes are not. We don't know what consciousness is. That's the problem. They're not conscious. I'll accept that they're not conscious, but they may be aware. They may know light from dark and move towards or away.
Okay.
So they do have some sentience of minimal thought.
I want to say.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's often come up. when I've listened to conversations like these, and I very rarely hear people talk about that. So just across the road from us, there's a house for severely mentally handicapped children,
Yeah.
and I often walk past there, and it's it's sad for me, and I often wonder when I think about consciousness. So there are children there who they cannot speak, they cannot move their limbs. They are they some of them are blind, some of them are deaf. Are they conscious in the same way that I'm conscious?
If you saw a man with multiple sclerosis, he could hardly move, he was paralyzed, and he was dribbling on the side of the mouth. Well, just let me follow through. You might be thinking the same things, and yet that was Stephen Hawking in his life.
That's exactly why.
Still working on the hardest questions of the universe.
Yeah.
So what we look like from the outside is not really a reflection of what we're like on the inside.
No.
Exactly.
But
I don't even think
because of an ethical question. Because how should we treat such people at that school?
You see, but that's why I don't even I don't know if it's complicating or simplifying the matter, but I don't even think we have to go to cats and dogs and mice and octopi. I think we can just think of somebody who we know. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Professor Solomons, who we interviewed on this program. So children who are born, literally, they just have a brain stem.
Yeah.
They don't have a cortex. They don't, for all practical purposes, they don't have a thinking brain. So, but yet we see them as conscious. So we don't even have to go, or do we? I don't know.
There's an example of children that are born with just a brain stem that grow up. They're told by their doctors, or the parents are told, that they'll never have a normal life. They grow up and they're able to talk just like anybody else, and they survive. I mean, I can't cite you the exact names. And there's examples of children that have where one of the halves of their brain has completely kind of collapsed, and yet they're still able to function. There's some quite amazing examples like that defy intuition. But I think in all of those examples, and plus the examples of the animals, the reasons I think people would, back to John's question, why is that important? Who judges? Well, I think we all might have an opinion on that as an important question when, as part of our lives, we eat animals and we treat animals perhaps with less respect than we treat humans. I mean, we know that's the case. How justified is that? Is that ethical? Is it more ethical to treat ants, without a care in the world than it is to treat pigs without a care in the world? Is there a difference there? See, if you were to accept my view of the world, I'd be saying, well, they're all conscious. And they're all they're actually equally conscious. Not just they all have awareness, but they can all feel pain.
Now's your chance. Now, give us your view of the world.
What's my view of the world? Well, just as a simple very quick backstory, then. From my time at university when I studied mathematical physics, and I identified that there were, I didn't identify, but I discovered that there were problems within physics, as I was saying, the search for the fundamental theory, the problems within quantum mechanics. There was also the problem of consciousness. And as I went through my life, I found there were lots and lots of other kind of problems that needed to be solved. At the age of 24, I had this big idea. It just dropped into my mind while I was driving the car one dark and stormy night. Very difficult to articulate at the time, put into words, but it was there as an image in my head, and it seemed to solve those problems. And I've spent the following 20 years or so trying to make sense of those ideas and seeing how they would solve the problems, in a fairly formal way. At some point, I wrote that book. In fact, that was about 2 years ago I published that. So at the age of 50, I decided I absolutely had to write this. So I stopped my work, stopped my career, I put that on hold, and 4 years later, I'd finished this book. And as it says there, it's an introduction to the theory of universal life and the solution to 12 intractable problems of life, universe, and consciousness.
Sure.
What's the big idea? The big idea in all of this is that, in fact, I can summarize it in 10 words, which I'll do.
Ooh, 10 points.
I should have this on a t-shirt. I keep meaning to do this, but the 10 words are very simple. Every living thing is a community of other living things. Okay? Every living thing is a community of other living things. We can see that's true for human beings, and in fact, all animals are communities of living cells, and these cells work in their day-to-day lives. Each cell has a different job to do, much in the same way that different humans have a different job to do in a community of humans. We might call a nation state or a company, but each cell then, a human being rather is nothing but the collection of cells that makes it up. So a human being is a community of cells. And what's interesting about that is that our life can be explained. The fact that we are alive can be explained by the fact that our cells are alive. Indeed, if our cells were to all die, then we would die. So their life and our life are intrinsically linked. Now you might then say, well, how does a cell have life? How does that come to be alive? If you were to say that every living thing is a community of living things, well, that would suggest that the cell gains its life from the life of the parts that form a cell, the organelles, and that the organelles get their life from the molecules, and the molecules get their life from the smaller molecules, and so on until you get to atoms and particles. Now, at some point you say, well, that as a scientist, a typical scientist would hear this and say, well, clearly that doesn't work, because why would you call an atom alive? That doesn't make any great sense. Why would you call a particle of matter alive? And at some point you get down to that fundamental layer of particles, where clearly those particles are not communities of other particles because they're fundamental. They're the very bottom of that chain. So scientists have a different explanation. And scientists would say that a living cell is a biochemical machine. And it works as a machine works. So when we build a machine of any kind, we build it from parts. And we know those parts obey certain scientific laws, whether it's laws of motion that Newton gave us, or whether it's laws of electricity, or even fluid dynamics if there's water involved. And because all of those parts follow those laws, that makes it a machine. And that's really what a human being is. That's what a cell is. And because a cell is a biochemical machine, that means that a human being is a machine. That's scientists' explanation of why we're alive, why I am able to wave my hand around the way I keep doing. The way I'm able to act, as opposed to this glass, which is not alive. It just sits there. It doesn't do anything. I'm alive and I'm able to act. And I'm able to act because I'm a machine. That's how science explains it. But science has got it wrong, because science is making a fundamental error, or it has fundamental beliefs which, in fact, there's no evidence to support. And that belief is that the behavior of atoms, particles, and molecules are determined by scientific laws, by the laws of physics in particular. Now we take that as a given. It's something we've just learnt to believe because that's what scientists have been saying for 300 years. But the fact is that all our laws of physics, including our laws of quantum mechanics, including Newton's laws of chemistry, laws, the gas laws, conservation laws, laws of thermodynamics, they all relate to systems of particles, of atoms, of molecules. They relate to large numbers of these things. What they don't do is relate to a single particle, a single atom, or a single molecule.
Mm-hmm.
So what it means is that we take it for granted that the movement of these things is determined by these laws, and yet we have no evidence for that. It's well known in the case of quantum mechanics that we can't predict where a single particle is going to go. But that's kind of the fundamental problem of quantum mechanics. And so we end up with theories that talk about probability.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also the case for atoms, because the behavior of an atom, when if it's interacting with other atoms, is actually determined by the behavior of the particles. And so, as I said, wherever we have a law of physics, whenever we test the law of physics, it really only relates to large numbers of these particles, atoms, or molecules.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because it also applies not just to small molecules, it also applies to larger complex organic molecules as you find in a cell. And it applies to the organelles that those molecules make up in the cell. And it applies to the cell, it applies to the organs of the body, and it applies to an organism such as a human being. So you've got this hierarchy of life
Mm-hmm.
that starts at the human being, it starts at an organism, and then you've got an organ, a cell, an organelle, a large complex organic molecule, you've got a simple organic molecule, an atom, the particle, the subparticle. Of all of these things, there are no laws of nature that allow us to predict their behavior. As much as scientists may assume that there must be, because that's what we tell each other. The reality is there isn't. All our laws of physics only relate to large numbers of these things. Now, why is this important? What it means is that a living thing is quite distinct from a machine, because any machine you can take apart into a finite number of parts which are predictable, whose behavior is predictable, using some kind of scientific law. You can't do that with human beings, because you've got these unpredictable entities, as I said, in that hierarchy of life, from cells, organelles, molecules, complex molecules, simple molecules. Because these there are unpredictable things at every layer in the hierarchy of life, it means that it is impossible to decompose a human being or any animal or any living thing into a finite number of simple, predictable parts.
Right. Can I jump in a minute there? Because what you seem to be saying is that we can understand the bottom layer of this hierarchy of sophistication, but once you get into the complex levels, then it's not possible to predict behavior because there's so many variables. Yeah,
that's what scientists tend to say. They say the reason we can't predict the behavior of a human being is because a human being is complex.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, and the thing that they're ignoring, is that fact applies to particles, it applies to atoms, to molecules, complex molecules, all the way up through that chain that I've described as the hierarchy of life. So this is a fact that they are ignoring. And
I would say that, sorry, John, I would say that more complex organisms are actually easier to, we can to a greater extent predict what a lion will do in certain circumstances than we can predict what will happen at the quantum level. Because so I would, if I follow what Tim says, then it's easier to predict what a larger system is going to do, even a biological system, than what at the subparticle level is going to happen.
We're predictable to an extent, Yes.
Yes, that's what I mean. So
But you
yes.
can't reliably, there are no laws of nature that will reliably predict what a human being will say next,
No,
or how they will
I
act.
agree.
So we are inherently unpredictable. And as I said, we tend to explain that away as being because we are complex biochemical machines. But what I'm trying to point out is that that unpredictability relates to these entities all the way down the chain. And it's because of that that we are qualitatively different to machines. So this whole idea that a human being is a biochemical machine is simply wrong. But the reason this is important is that we therefore can't explain the functioning of a cell, or indeed of a human being, by reference to this analogy of a machine. We need a better explanation, and that's what I'm offering.
Tim, I want to ask, because even so, a generator or a radio, which is a machine, the electricity, the copper the copper in that machine, there are atoms in that copper, and there are particles in that copper, and surely those particles are as unpredictable as the particles that make up my cells, which means that even a machine is unpredictable. Is that, does it not follow?
It doesn't follow, and I'll tell you what. It's the
Okay,
it's the
tell me
law
why.
of large numbers. Well, it's called colloquially as the law of large numbers. So as long as you have, so any single electron in a wire would be unpredictable in the way it behaves. Nobody can track a single electron or predict what it will do. But if you have enough electrons and you call the flow of you call it the flow of electricity, then you can predict what the flow will do. So you can predict the flow of water just through a stream. You can say how fast it will go, and if we increase the pressure, the water will flow faster through a particular channel. So the stream, because the water particles, the water molecules exist in a large enough number, the behavior of the stream is entirely predictable, even though the behavior of any single molecule is entirely unpredictable. Now, this is what I'm proposing, which is quite distinct from what scientists currently believe. They believe that there ought to be a law somewhere that would tell you how a single molecule will behave, but they can never find it, and they can always cover themselves by saying, yes, but it's just complicated. We need too much information. We can't do it. I'm saying no. There's a reason we can't do it. The reason we can't do it is that the behavior of atoms, particles, molecules they determine their own behavior in the same way I determine my own behavior. So these particles don't follow individually. They don't follow a law in the same way that individually I don't follow a law. I mean, I might follow a law to an extent. Here in this country, we drive on the left-hand side of the road, and broadly speaking, you can trust that most people will. And if you look at the stream of traffic, it'll always stick to the left. But some individuals won't, and they'll drive off, and they'll go over the line, and they'll behave in different ways. So the same principle applies to human beings, you see. So that as a mass of human beings, you can predict how that mass will behave, as long as they're not talking to each other and colluding, but that mass will behave in a certain way, even though such as the laws of supply and demand. We can have laws of economics that say, if the demand goes up, then the price will go up. We can define that sort of thing. So we know broadly how human beings will behave en masse, but we can't say how any individual will behave.
That's very interesting, because it fits with my view of morality, which I maintain is a conceptual thing. We've invented laws and rules that we would like to follow. They are desires of behavior, but in fact, in reality, at the natural realm level, what we have is evolved social behavior. For social animals, it's necessary to cooperate, and so whatever you should be doing shouldn't be likely to destroy the possibility of cooperation with those around you. But what I want to bring up here is a couple of things. What's your attitude to emergence then?
It's one of those nonsenses that philosophers and scientists come up with because they have no explanation. In terms of hard emergence, I mean, weak emergence is understood, but strong, sort of strong emergence. So consciousness, for example, we can't explain how consciousness is created from the movement of particles of matter in the brain. And so we invent something called emergence that puts a word to something which is mysterious. And by putting a word to it, we commit ourselves that we understand it. Because, oh, well, that's just emergence. And in fact, we don't understand it at all because it makes no sense. It's not possible. You can't have something like consciousness emerging from the movement of particles which are not conscious. You can only have consciousness coming from particles which are conscious, which is how my theory would have.
So basically, sorry, John, what you're saying is particles are conscious.
Particles are conscious. Particles, in fact, I know we're kind of running out of time, but the way you create a complete picture of the world along the lines I was describing, every living thing is a community of other living things. What it means is that we reject the biochemical machine analogy for a living thing, and instead we replace it with this infinite hierarchy of living things within living things, so that every particle is itself a community of smaller particles, which are themselves communities of smaller particles, and it goes on ad infinitum. Interestingly, what that means is that if there are as many layers in the structure of a particle of matter as there are within the structure of a human being. Do you see what I mean? A human being breaks down into organs, into cells, into organelles, and so on. And that makes it tremendously complex because there are billions of these things. What it means is that a particle of matter is as complex as a human being. So this whole image we have in our minds of simple particles that physicists will tell us is the truth, based on no evidence whatsoever, I'm saying is wrong. And I'm confidently saying that's wrong, because the minute you change the picture and allow those particles to be as complex, indeed infinitely complex, as every other living thing in that hierarchy, then you've got a whole world of possibilities open up. And all of the big problems, like the problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining quantum mechanics, the problem of explaining why the universe is finely tuned for life, the problem of explaining the origin of life, even what caused the Big Bang. There are all of these kind of unsolvable problems are suddenly solvable by challenging that fundamental belief that there's a foundational layer of indivisible particles determined by the laws of nature. That's the bit I'm taking out. Just take out that idea of a fundamental layer, allow it to go on forever, allow living things to be infinitely complex as opposed to machines which are finitely complex. Suddenly all the problems can be solved.
So you're saying that...
Oh, you read this book.
Good plug. Well done. So you're saying that I don't like the word infinite, I'm afraid.
Most philosophers hate it. For philosophers, there's something called the homunculus fallacy, and it says essentially if you try and solve consciousness by ending up with an infinite regression, then you're falling into the homunculus fallacy. Clearly you've got it wrong. But why? Why
infinite regression?
Regression? Why?
You can't have an infinite regression. It's been drummed into us.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that every quark is made up of tiny quarks, and every tiny quarklet is made up of tinier quarklets.
And it's quarks all the way down.
It's quarks all the way down. Indeed it is.
So, oh dear.
Well, it's living things all the way down.
It's what things?
Living things.
Living things. Now, so to what extent is a quark alive?
To the same extent that you are.
No, I'm much more capable than a quark.
What tells you that? Have you met one?
Not personally, no.
There you go. You're making assumptions. You're making fundamental assumptions about the world based on tales that physicists have told you. Can they draw? Tell you what, if they ever try to draw a quark, they'll draw just a little ball, won't they? A little circle. Where do they get that from? Based on nothing whatsoever. They'll just say,
well, that goes back to...
We'll draw a circle. You could do that for human beings. You could just draw a little circle and say that's a human being. In real life, if you were another human being, you'd see them as a complex.
Yeah, that idea goes back to... Was it the Greek? Was it Demetros, the guy who came up with the idea that everything's made of atoms, or atomos, as he would have said back then?
Is it Demosthenes? Was it not Demosthenes, one of those guys?
I think you were right in the first place.
I can't remember. It's a long time ago.
It wasn't Demetrios. I think
it began with a D, and I'm struggling to remember myself.
I'll Google it. I'll Google it directly.
Thank you. Do that. Yeah, it was a D guy. We remember that much. Yeah. Wow. So what am I going to do now? You've just blown my mind.
Well, I mean, I could explain how some of the problems are solved that the book tries to solve, that this theory tries to solve.
So not only life, presumably, but consciousness goes right down to infinitely. There is no fundamental bottom to this the reducto game.
Indeed. So consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe. It's a fundamental property of living things. It's what motivates life. Whenever I move my hand, I'm doing so because my conscious brain is motivating it, or my consciousness is motivating it. It isn't something that can be created. So we don't need to talk about emergence, really, or how is conscious? How does the brain create consciousness? Because it doesn't.
Okay, now here's a question.
Yeah.
What about before matter? I mean, according to the standard model of cosmology, there wasn't always matter, not even quarks. Once upon a time, there was just energy. Now, I have problems conjecturing that personally, but how does that fit into your theory of infinitely reduced consciousness and life?
We can only, there is something that physicists will call the observable universe. So we can only observe so far out in space, and the evidence that we have can only take us back so far back in time. It's actually quite a long way, a physicist would say, because we can speculate what happened in those early parts of the universe, fractions of a second after the Big Bang, they would say. But equally, there's another dimension that I would refer to that is quite key to my theory, which is scale. And so we can only look down in scale so far. We can only look down to atoms, to particles, and quarks is about the lowest level. And we can't really look. We're speculating based on the sort of experimental results that we have. And beyond that, we're getting even more speculative. So we can't really look beyond that. Now, I'm saying the fact that we can't look beyond that doesn't mean there's nothing beyond that. In the same way that the fact that we can only look so far into the universe doesn't mean there's nothing beyond the observable universe. So I'm saying there's many, many layers below those particles. It's just that they're so remote from us, we can't see anything. And if we were to go back in time, right towards what that moment that we call the Big Bang, which in my theory never happened, by the way. Okay, that's another story. But if you go back towards that apparent moment, yes, all of the particles disappear. And as you say, physicists will just say, we'll call that energy. But energy in that sense is a bit of a hand waving sort of, we don't know what is below those particles, so we'll just call it energy. But the reality is there would be the other particles of which quarks and photons are made of.
Right. Wow.
So there would be another universe. And if I was pushed to try and explain why the Big Bang never happened, the Big Bang is a little bit like a point on the horizon If you imagine a flat plane where all the lines on the flat
Hang on. Sorry, Tim.
Horizon.
Can we have you back and talk about why the Big Bang never happened at another time? Because
I would love to. Yeah. We are running out of time, aren't we?
Great.
But I want to finish your thought, because basically what you're saying, Tim, is like a point on the horizon. As you walk towards it, the horizon just moves and moves and moves and moves and moves. You never get to it.
You never get to it.
The Big Bang is analogous to that.
It's exactly analogous to that. If you were to travel back towards the Big Bang, you would have to get smaller and smaller because bigger things don't exist anymore. As you got smaller and smaller, time starts to expand, because the smaller the living thing, the bigger that time becomes. So the time comes, for a second, a human second might last a minute for an ant, and it might last a day for something a cell. So as you go back into particles, time stretches out, and the Big Bang recedes until it never actually happens at all.
Oh,
John, I know we 1 minute and 20 seconds past the time, but I just want to summarize for our next conversation, because I think we'll have Tim on again. Can I think of what you're saying in regards to living things in life and consciousness as being analogous to, in the 16th century, before the development of the microscope, it was thought that male semen contained tiny little fully developed humans, and that they were implanted into the woman's body, and there was nothing wrong with that belief, because with the knowledge that was available at the time due to the viewing instruments, that was a perfectly logical, intuitive idea to have. And what we're doing now, we're in the same situation in regards to that. We can't see that far down, because it's just like in the time of Antoni van Leeuwenhoek, it wasn't possible to see even sperm cells. You couldn't even see sperm. You're in the same type of situation. Is just to summarize, is that a good analogy to explain where we are now? And then maybe in future there might be technology developed that enables us to see at deeper levels, and we can see that what we thought were tiny little humans inside male sperm are not tiny little humans inside male sperm. Is that a good analogy?
I mean, yes, from the point of view that we make speculative theories about things that we can't.
Yes, I mean the analogy is.
Point in time, we find that our theories were not quite right.
Yes, that's as far as the analogy goes.
Absolutely, but as to whether we will definitely be able to fine tune strengthen the microscopes to be able to see below an atom, I can't guarantee that, I'm afraid, because I do think there is a limit to the observable universe in terms of scale. So there may be a limit, but I'm almost certainly any picture that a physicist will draw of an atom or of a particle, they don't know that it's as simple as they're drawing it, whether it's a wave or a particle. Occam's razor says you don't draw it any more complex than it needs to be, otherwise you're speculating unnecessarily. So you make it simple, but that doesn't mean it is simple. And that belief that small is simple is one of those fundamental beliefs that I personally want to challenge, because I think there's a benefit in challenging that, because I think if we open our minds and allow us to believe that something as small as a particle of matter could be as complex as a human being, do you know what? It opens up so many other possibilities for solutions to problems that otherwise we simply cannot solve.
Which Tim is going to tell us about when he comes back to the show. So I just want to say that next week we've got a chap called David Knight who has a Facebook group that he wants somebody else to take over from him. So there's an opportunity. Watch us again next week. Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Tercia, thank you for your contributions too. Thank you, viewers, and in particular, Dean, who I liked your contributions, Dean, tonight. And thank you to future viewers. And just everybody say goodbye.
Bye-bye.